Have any of you listening out there over the course of your life ever believed in fate? Have you ever been caught up in a moment that made you forget the unpredictability of the world around you? That a certain moment was far too perfect to have happened by chance? Well, in 2015, a small group of passengers on a Paris-bound train had such a realization. A man with bad intentions entered a train car carrying a box cutter, an automatic pistol, and an AK-47. Now, in that train car were two American soldiers. And the primary threat those two soldiers had spent their military careers training for and preparing themselves to fight against had just stepped into their train car. These two men acted quickly and without hesitation, and before anyone could even process what happened, the man was subdued, reducing what could have been a massacre to a couple of scrapes from a box cutter. Now, you can call it fate, or you can call it chance, or you could just boil it down to their training, but whatever you call it, those two men saved the day and the lives of those passengers on that train. There could have been any number of variables that would have changed the outcome entirely, but I'd argue that they were simply the right people in the right place at the right time. For yours truly, that phenomena is something observable throughout all of human history. And it's usually the major world-changing events that foster the most extreme examples of men and women of destiny. The man we're going to start our story with today is someone that, at least in my mind, falls into that category. Now, before I get started, this would be a good time to mention that while I am a combat veteran and I do have some legitimacy in this realm, I am not a historian, and I won't claim to be. I'll always do my best in my research to try to get all of my facts right, but know that I'm not a historian as we move forward. Now, getting back to our story, the man I had just mentioned who falls into that category, the man of destiny category, he's going to do so in a way that's more complicated and divisive to the people viewing it, and that's both then and now compared to the two U.S. soldiers on that train. But the fact remains that whether you believe this man's actions were just and righteous or misled and evil, he still seems, to me, to have been in the right place at the right time. And this man is notoriously known by the nickname Osawatomie. And at the age of 59 years old, he finds himself in deep thought, riding in an open wagon, destined to be hanged by the neck. And to make matters worse, he's sitting on the box that will soon become his own coffin. I mean, how's that for mental torture? You know, hey, we're going to take you down the road a ways to hang you, but don't worry, sit back and relax right here on this box. Oh, by the way, that's what we're going to bury you in when we're done. I mean, mind blown. That's crazy. And I feel like for your average Joe, to include myself, that would be a terrifying way to spend your last moments. But from the few reports we have of people that were there at the scene, we're not painted an image of a fearful man facing his death, but of a man who has peacefully resigned himself to that fate. Now, as someone who's been in a fair amount of combat, not the most by any means, but enough to know certain things, I can speak to a unique phenomenon that occurs as a result of repeated and intense exposure to battle. And this is the true acceptance of your mortality. And I don't mean the idea or the inkling, but the factual knowledge that death is coming for you before you go home. You don't know the day, you don't know the time, but you accept that death has your name on his agenda. And doing this mental backflip can be a very useful tool for a serviceman or woman. It can allow you to operate and do your job with little interference from fear because, in a weird way, you've kind of sidestepped your fears. But I feel as though that kind of acceptance of death, the kind that troops face in combat, is not entirely the same as what Osawatomie is accepting. And this isn't in any way taking away from the terrorist troops facing combat and the mental hardships they endure. Trust me, I know. War can be terrifying and overwhelming. But this is to point out the difference between the two mindsets, because Osawatomie does know the day and time of his death. He even knows the means by which he'll be killed. And I don't know about you, but death by hanging is at the very bottom of my list on ways I'd prefer to go out. But Osawatomie, according to every account I could find, didn't seem fazed by the prospect of that news. That peaceful resignation is something I feel is only witnessed in individuals who know their purpose in life wholly, or at least believe wholeheartedly in a purpose they have convinced themselves is theirs. And not only that, but they must have determined to dedicate themselves and their efforts entirely to progressing that purpose. For Osawatomie, he had heavenly motivation driving him. He believed his purpose was given to him, or more accurately, commanded of him by God. And something to consider in all of this, whether they're good or evil, but someone with that kind of conviction will inevitably attract supporters and followers. There is a certain charisma that's either a characteristic of the type of person they are, or it's a characteristic of the dedication and single-minded focus that those kind of people portray. The executioners knew the influence people like Osawatomie could have on a population during a tense moment in time, and they were terrified of those possibilities. The last thing anyone in a position of authority wanted in that moment was for Osawatomie to speak to an audience that would then take his final words and print them in every newspaper in the country. To give you an idea of how worried they were about this, just in an effort to keep people from coming to watch the hanging, there were entire railway systems shut down in the days leading up to this execution. There was also a military detachment deployed to guard the execution proceedings, and it's going to number somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 men. I mean, call me crazy, but that seems excessive for one guy. But that was just their attempt, the powers that be at least, at neutralizing the charisma of both the man and the moment. And I know this is the first time I've mentioned the moment in time possessing charisma, so bear with me. What I mean by that is, the moment was captivating. It fueled deep emotions and passions in the people living through it to a point where the tension was combustible. Half of the country is going to view Osawatomie as a villain. Many of them are going to view him as a terrorist. But the other half of the country view Osawatomie not as evil, but as righteous, a moral hero moments from becoming a martyr for the cause of freedom. And that's some powerful stuff. That's why the powers that be felt so much pressure to keep Osawatomie isolated from the public. But regardless of their efforts, fate has a funny way of intervening in history. And when fate wants something done, fate will get something done. Because on the morning of the execution, the jailer comes to retrieve Osawatomie from his cell. And keep in mind, this is the same jailer that's been guarding him and handling him since his arrest 7 weeks earlier. And in that time, I have to believe that some sort of bond developed between the two men, at least to some degree. I mean, it's hard to think that a condemned man and the one charged with handling their final moments of life don't share a very rare and intimate experience. It's on the human spectrum. I mean, that's about as rare as it gets. Whatever their relationship or bond, Osawatomie must have felt some sort of trust in his jailer, because as he exits his cell, he hands the jailer a few personal items. He's going to hand him a silver watch, and that's to be given to his wife after his execution, and he hands him a folded piece of paper. The jailer takes both, and Osawatomie is transported to the scaffold. He's going to say a few quick farewells to the men nearby, have the hood and noose placed over his head, and at 11:30 on December 2nd, 1859, he will be hung. Now, at some point after the hanging, the guard unfolds the note Osawatomie gave him, and what the guard reads is a prophecy of what's to come. And it's written in this language that makes it sound biblical, almost. In just 2 sentences, Osawatomie will ominously lay out the path to solving the divide over slavery as an institution here in the United States. And he's going to do so accurately, it's almost unnerving. His prophecy begins with his name penned in black ink, a name by which he's better known today. Osawatomie is John Brown, and written on that scrap of paper are his last words. Quote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed, it might be done. End quote. I mean, I feel like I can hear the rumbling thunder crack after that first line. The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Boom! Hollywood couldn't write foreshadowing into a script better than that. John Brown's God-given mission, whether legitimate or perceived, was to free the American slave. And although his execution may not have caused the instantaneous death of slavery as an institution, it would be the wound by which the nation could purge itself of its crimes. The blood required for that purge, John Brown's final words warned of, would soon be pouring from that wound at a sickening velocity. But before we get into the volleys of musket fire and explosive shells of total war, I'd like to take you back to a time just before this, because to better understand what's to come, you must first understand what's transpired. Now, over the course of this first season, we will look at the people, places, and events that make up the story of the U.S. Civil War to better understand the human elements of the history that defines us as a nation, striving to always remember and cherish the lineage of the American warrior and to connect our current and future American warriors to those of our past, where time may vary the instruments of war, but the combat experience remains the same. I am Colby Sumner, and this is America, Fog of War.
Pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of...
The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender.
Found a diary under the heading My Pledge. He had written these words: America must win this war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure.
I'm sure there's some of you out there that are dying to know what exactly John Brown did to end up at the end of that noose. I'm assuming that because I know I would be if I were in your shoes. But I'm a sucker for a good story. And in this podcaster's humble opinion, skipping straight to the climactic scene would ruin ours. And not only that, but if John Brown's execution is the blow that, like we said earlier, inflicts the wound by which the nation could purge itself, its impact and effectiveness is a direct result of the many people and events that acted as the softening blows in the struggle that preceded it. I like to think of it like a boxer. And our boxer, his strategy in this fight is to target the body for the first 10 rounds of a 12-round fight. And the goal of that strategy in this fight is with every strike to the gut that's going to weaken and exhaust the opponent measurably and with greater effect each time, so that when rounds 11 and 12 arrive, our boxer's opponent can't move as quickly, they can't defend as effectively, they can't catch their breath, their legs are sapped of energy and strength. And that moment then is when our boxer, instead of targeting the body, will target the now easy-to-hit head. And when that blow finds its mark, it does so with an effectiveness that it otherwise wouldn't have had. Now, I must say as a reminder, the purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of American wars and the American warriors that fought them. But the topic of slavery here in America is so deeply woven into our national identity and is such a driving force in the story of the Civil War that it would be negligent not to discuss it. Now, with that being said, there are so many subtopics and stories related to slavery in the U.S., as well as the thousands of contributors to its eventual demise. that it could be an entire podcast show on its own, and I unfortunately will not be able to dive that deeply into the subject of slavery here in the United States. I will, however, try to hit some of the more important ones and highlight some things that stood out to me while researching this season. And some of the first things I noticed was the many different motivators and justifications used to oppose and defend the institution of slavery. Things like racism and financial gain are obvious. They're very easy to spot even over 150 years after the fact. But what about things like religion, political ambition, or economic development, all of which will be used strategically by those who supported slavery and those who opposed it? One of the crazier things to think about is using something like the institution of science as a justification for slavery. What we consider today to be pseudosciences, things like phrenology, were looked at as factual science in the 19th century by a large group of people. And for those of you that don't know what phrenology is, that's the measurement of bumps on the skull to predict the mental traits of groups of people. There's a climactic scene that features phrenology in one of Quentin Tarantino's movies, Django Unchained. And even in, the hands of a Hollywood producer, that movie doesn't take much liberty or license with that scene. That was the real deal. To give you an example of someone that believed phrenology in its, in air quotes, findings, the man who established the University of Louisville's School of Medicine, that's Dr. Charles Caldwell, is just that kind of person. Not only did he believe the findings of phrenology to be true, but he spent much of his life teaching those ideas to as many people as he could. He believed, because of what he perceived as the biological and anthropological tendencies of Black Americans, that, quote, the Africans must have a master, end quote. Now that's extreme. Obviously, that's insanity. But mainstream at the time. And what makes this era even harder to navigate from our place in time is how conflicting the ideas of the period were. Typically, when dealing with an issue from the past, if it's far enough back in time, we're willing to forgive, or at least give a little bit of slack to the people in that time because of something I like to call civilizational ignorances. For example, the people of the past might think the earth is flat, and as incorrect or misled as that might be, we're willing to cut them a little bit of slack and justify it by saying, man, they really didn't know. They didn't know any better. But how do you cut those people slack when many, many other people from that same era in time seem as though they do know better? But a vast number of people use those same findings to support the abolition narrative as well. And finding a logically sound pathway by which to navigate how the same exact information can produce such polar opposite opinions feels like the mental equivalent of a square peg, round hole situation. In his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson sums up his thoughts on the black race. Quote, comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to the whites, in reason much inferior, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind, end quote. I mean, clearly that entire quote is wildly, wildly racist. But just a few years later, a black mathematician, Benjamin Banneker, sends a letter to Thomas Jefferson along with an almanac containing his work. Jefferson will respond, and this is what he writes in the letter, quote, Sir, I thank you sincerely for the letter of the 19th instant, and for the almanac it contained. Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men, and that the appearance of a want of them is owing merely to the degraded condition of their existence both in Africa and America. I can add with truth that nobody wishes more ardently to see a good system commenced for raising the condition both of their body and mind to what it ought to be, as fast as the imbecility of their present existence and other circumstance, which cannot be neglected, will admit. I have taken the liberty of sending your almanac to Monsieur de Condorcet, Secretary of the Academy of Sciences at Paris, and a member of the Philanthropic Society, because I consider it as a document to which your whole color had a right for their justification against the doubts which have been entertained of them. I am with great esteem, sir, your most obedient, humble servant, Thomas Jefferson. End quote. I mean, how is anybody with our modern-day worldviews and morals supposed to make sense of that? This is the same guy that intentionally writes into the Declaration the line, all men are created equal. And maybe I'm projecting my 21st century morals onto the interpretation, but I believe he truly used men, in air quotes, in the all of mankind sense of the word. He is also the guy that will keep and own slaves until the day he dies. I mean, it's just so conflicting. And these personal conflicting morals don't solely originate or stem from Jefferson. I mean, there's account after account of ideas just like this from all kinds of people, from the origin of the nation to the end of the war we're covering this season. Actually, in fact, we're going to see many examples of it throughout this season, this same kind of double-edged logic. Religion, as I mentioned before, is another area of life that was weaponized in the defense of slavery. Richard Furman, the first president of the South Carolina State Baptist Convention, published an essay in 1822 defining what he believed the relationship between the church and slavery was. To do so, he uses the Bible to draw examples of the master-slave relationship. Quote, "In things purely spiritual, they appear to have enjoyed equal privileges, but their relationship as masters and slaves were not dissolved. Their respective duties are strictly enjoined. The servants under the yoke, mentioned by Paul to Timothy as having believing masters, are not authorized by him to demand of them emancipation or to employ violent means to obtain it, but are directed to account their masters worthy of all honor and not to despise them because they were brethren in religion, but then rather to do them service because they were faithful and beloved partakers of the Christian benefit." End quote. As were many other people in America, I was raised in a very Christian household. And the fact that those words were penned by a supposed man of God makes me feel, after reading them, like I've been in a room with pure evil. It's hard to imagine people actually believing something like that. They did, though. And that's something to keep in mind when looking at the supporters of slavery in this era. The crazy notions you and I look at today and think there's no way anybody believed that. That's crazy. Were very much believed at the time. And I consider myself to be more on the nurture side of things when it comes to the human personality development, nature versus nurture. I feel like the phrase, I'm a product of my environment or you're a product of your environment can be applied to most people. The people of the past were no exception to this, and from the Egyptians to the Mongols, the Romans to the Ottomans, and everything else in between, from the beginning of time to the point in our story we're at currently, slavery had been an accepted part of life. But what makes this era specifically, that's the 19th century in the U.S., so dynamic on this issue is many people begin believing the counter-narrative to the status quo, and they're willing to act upon those beliefs in ways they just weren't before. Because, like I said, religion will be used by both sides of the argument, and although you can point to many instances throughout history where Christianity has been used to promote evils, just like the quote we referenced moments earlier, you can point to just as many instances of where it's accomplished incredible and wonderful things for humanity. This next part we're going to look at, I would consider to be one of those great things, not from a standpoint of of spreading religion or earning more souls to the church kind of a thing. But I look at it as a wonderful thing based on the fact that it contributes massively to the abolition of slavery in America. And how it does this is it changes and redefines a baseline understanding of something. Christianity in this era will challenge and, like I said, redefine the understanding of man's responsibility to his fellow man. And what develops as a result of this shift in perspective is the notion that we are all God's children. And if that were really the case, how could anyone keep a fellow child of God bound in slavery? And this notion, it takes hold in such a way that you know, if you're raised here in America now, you don't even have to have ever stepped foot into a church to know that saying and to understand what it means. It's just become part of the culture in a way. This movement will become known as the Second Great Awakening, and like the raging forest fire an idea can sometimes be, this idea is going to spread rapidly. There will be astronomical amounts of revivals in the northern states, even reaching communities, secluded way out in the middle of nowhere. Counties and townships that would normally not get reached by things like this are going to be exposed to these ideas. Both sides of our argument are expanding their influence and adding to their numbers. And just like now, just like nowadays, if something gets this much steam behind it, it was only a matter of time before something like this ended up on the national political stage. To do so, the argument presented itself as one of the considerations needed for expansion. The issue is, as America grows and admits new states into the Union, will those states be slave states or free states? And the outcome of that choice presents even more political considerations. The question of electorates is one that jumps out fairly quickly to me. Whether the new state is slave or free directly determines which party the electorates will be cast in support of. The type of economy is another consideration that is directly influenced by that new state's policy towards slavery. And the economy is another area North and South find themselves in a battle for control over the outcome of war. The South pushing for an agrarian society, and as they have been since the start of this whole thing, and the North beginning more and more to promote an industrial one. But if you look closely, you can take away all the facts that, a certain economy will bring with it and why it should be used or why that one shouldn't be used. And you can look at electorates and do the same thing. When you get down to the baseline motivation behind the considerations for all of that, it stems from one thing, and that's the argument surrounding slavery. Well, as a result of the ongoing argument in the halls of Congress, in March of 1820, they will pass what's called the Missouri Compromise. And this is a piece of legislation that would allow Maine and Missouri to enter the Union, but with some stipulations. Maine would enter the Union as a free state, and Missouri would enter as a slave state. But from that date forward, slavery could not expand north of a specific latitudinal line. And those are those imaginary lines you learn about in elementary school, the ones, you know what I'm talking about. They're pretty much on every globe you can find. That latitudinal line will be the parallel 3630 north. I couldn't imagine that to begin with, my freedom being decided by a line, an imaginary line, on a map. But at the time, many people think that's going to work. Now, real quick, to give you an idea of where this runs, this parallel line runs, I will try my best to describe this with just words and no visual component to this show. But it might help if you pull up a map of the U.S. just in case. If you're looking at a map of the U.S., imagine a line starting at the southwestern corner of Missouri and passing west through the top part of Oklahoma, just about as deep as the Panhandle. The line will continue west, skirting the northern border of Texas and continuing further westward through upper New Mexico. And that's generally the path of the 3630 parallel. And as I said before, many people at the time are going to think this will settle this dispute once and for all. But what those people failed to realize was that ambition, and particularly that found within the political realm, tends to consider that keeping a promise, especially one made by the previous generation, is far less satisfying and rewarding than getting what you want. And it won't take long before politicians start testing the compromise for vulnerabilities. You know, Abraham Lincoln in his House Divided speech delivered many years after the Compromise of 1820 seemed to be one of the few politicians that understood the true vulnerability of any compromise made regarding slavery. He would say this in that speech, quote, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other," end quote. But as I said before, I think Lincoln is one of the few that actually believed this notion. One of my favorite things to watch growing up was the Ken Burns Civil War documentary. And if you've ever watched it before, you know Shelby Foote is one of the main draws to that documentary series. He's an author that's known for his narrative account of the Civil War. It's a 3-volume set. And Shelby Foote is one of the men that Ken Burns interviews for, you know, the cut-ins when they have an expert talk about this, you know, this specific part or this specific part. And Shelby Foote's got this, you know, very gentlemanly Southern accent, and he's addressing the various causes for the Civil War in an episode of this documentary. And the point that he makes is the reason Americans found themselves in a civil war to begin with was because of a failure to compromise. He says that that's what Americans do best, is we compromise. Well, in my opinion, it was the compromising that led to the war, not the lack of it. But there is still quite some time before we reach that point in our story. In the meantime, another war was looming in America's near future. And as war has demonstrated many times throughout history, it has the capacity to shake things up enough to crack those vulnerabilities we just talked about a little bit ago. And when the smoke and dust of combat finally settles, that's exactly what it does. If you're a history lover, like Brett and I, then books are probably your guilty pleasure. I don't know about you, but I'm buying my next book usually long before I finish the book I'm reading at the time. Well, over the last few years, I find myself buying the audio version of books more and more. That's because I can listen to more books in a year than I could read in a year. Audiobooks give me the ability to listen at times that reading just isn't an option, when I'm driving or when I'm mowing the lawn, and my favorite, when I'm going to bed. Especially when the narrator has a good voice, it'll knock me right out. If you feel the same way, or if reading isn't your thing, but you think audiobooks might be something you could enjoy, then Brett and I recommend you try Audible Plus. Audible Plus is a brand new, all-you-can-listen membership that offers access to thousands of titles, including a vast array of audiobooks, podcasts, and originals that span all genres, lengths, and formats. Visit americafogofwar.com and follow the link Try Audible Plus, located in the menu at the top of the homepage, to get access to your free 30-day trial and stream all the Plus catalog content you want. I'm going to take just a second here and get my history nerd on a little, because the next part of our story contains one of my favorite aspects of history, and there's no way I'm not going to point it out. You can see it play out with leaders like Eisenhower and Patton, Petraeus and Mattis. Even our first leader, George Washington, would be an example. The thing all of those masters of warfare had in common was a primer to combat. You know, a war for them to fight in early on in their careers. An opportunity to take the theories taught in the classrooms and in training exercises and employ them in real life-or-death combat. Well, men like William Tecumseh Sherman and Thomas Stonewall Jackson long before he earns the euphemistic title. Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant and many, many others destined for greatness on the battlefields of the Civil War will too have a primer to combat. Now, motivated by a desire for expansion, President James K. Polk is going to commit the U.S. to a war with Mexico in 1846. And this is the primer for almost every person you have ever heard of in the Civil War. And this may be a war we cover in a future season of America Fog of War, so I won't get into the campaigns and battles, but just know that everyone is there. Even the future president of the Confederacy is there fighting. Young junior officers like Ulysses S. Grant will cut their teeth in combat fighting this war against Mexico. And the lessons they learn will be one of the factors that lead to the extreme devastation we will see in the conflict to come. This war will have more than just that effect on our story, though. Perhaps the more dominant outcome of the war with Mexico, at least in the immediate aftermath, was what to do with the newly annexed land now in the possession of the United States. Listen, at the close of the war, the U.S. had acquired the areas of modern-day Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California. I mean, that's a ton of land to figure out what to do with. Well, just as before, expansion reignites the argument surrounding slavery. And just as before, that argument will end up in the halls of federal government. This time, however, that argument's going to manifest itself in two separate waves. The first would be the introduction of the Compromise of 1850. Now, this piece of legislation was originally proposed as an omnibus bill, and we all know what that is. That's when they cram a bunch of different unrelated things into one bill and push it all through. They do that a lot in our modern-day politics. Well, when this bill meets resistance in the halls of government, the creators of the bill decide, let's hand it over to a senator with enough political ambition and energy to get the bill passed. Well, from what I've read about this senator, that's exactly what he has. And that's none other than Stephen A. Douglas. And this is the same Douglas of the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. He's going to decide to strip these bills down to their key components and put together a majority for each part individually. And there are 4 of them. The organization of New Mexico and Utah into territories, the admittance of California into the Union as a new state, the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and an updated Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the one key component that will cause the most damage to the relationship between North and South is the final one, the Fugitive Slave Act. In 1793, the first act to be called by that name was passed. It authorized slave owners to cross state lines to recapture escaped slaves and bring them before any local magistrate or federal court to prove ownership. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 attempted to deny fugitive slaves the protection of habeas corpus, the right to testify on their own behalf, and the right to a trial by jury. Now, the reason I say it attempted to do all those things is because northern states, not wanting to be forced into the slave trade business, decided they didn't want to play along with these new laws. So they'll end up enacting personal liability laws. These personal liability laws granted rights back to the fugitives that the act sought to deny them originally. And depending on the state, fugitives could now enjoy the rights to testify of habeas corpus and to a trial by jury. Again, that could be all of them, one of them, a mixed bag of goodies depending on which state you were in. These personal liability laws, however, would impose criminal penalties for kidnapping and even prohibit the use of state facilities in the recapture of fugitives. I really like the kidnapping part there because that's essentially what they had to do to bring these poor accused fugitive slaves before a court, is kidnap them. Now, these countermeasures to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 would become a great motivation for the proposal of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. In the eyes of the pro-slavery supporters, this update to version 2.0 would close up all the loopholes northern states were using to avoid the mandates of the first version. Again, requiring the denial of habeas corpus, the rights to testify and to trial by jury, this new version would also create a new office that would have concurrent jurisdiction with the U.S. Circuit and District Courts as well as the inferior courts, so basically all of the courts. Federal commissioners would be appointed to decide if a claimant, and that's either the slave owners or the slave hunters, had in their possession the accused fugitive slave they sought to recapture. Now, the commissioners were to make their decision based on one of 2 ways, either by way of affidavit from a slave state court or by the testimony of a white witness. I mean, how on earth was an accused person ever going to have a chance? And to make the odds of a fair ruling stacked against them even greater, the commissioners would be paid for their rulings, but they would be paid differently depending on what they ruled. They'd get $5 for a ruling in favor of the accused, saying that, whoever has been brought before him as a fugitive slave is in fact not a fugitive slave, and letting them go free, they get paid $5 for that. Now, for ruling in favor of the claimant, again, that's the slave owner or the fugitive slave hunter, would earn them $10. It would double their paycheck. And I know $10 nowadays doesn't sound like a lot. $10 in the mid-19th century is a ton of money. Now, I don't know about you, but to me it doesn't seem like it takes an oracle to see all of the terrible outcomes that incentive will generate for countless black Americans living in the North. Understandably, the northern states and its citizens felt this legislation was forcing them to do the dirty job of slave trading for their neighbors to the south. And for many Northerners, refusal to be party to the evil practice was the only option available. I mean, many decide to actively work and fight against it. There are multiple accounts of citizen mobs breaking detained fugitive slaves out of jail and then helping them cross the border to Canada. I love it, too. It's just, they're so colorful, and there's twists and turns. It was one of my favorite things to read in my research for this episode. They're fascinating to me. Newspapers are going to feature article after article pointing out all the injustices and evils of this new law. The Fugitive Slave Act is also going to motivate people in other realms of society. Harriet Beecher Stowe will write and publish her extremely popular book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which by itself was a massive contributor to the forces pushing John Brown and the country to the point of total war. I mean, just keep in mind that it is the second most sold book in the world in the 19th century, and it's second only to the Bible. And some powerful stuff. As I said earlier, the argument surrounding slavery hit America and the American government in two separate waves. Obviously, the Compromise of 1850 was the first wave. That second wave, which is also going to be proposed by Senator Douglas, will transform the mostly verbal dispute up to this point into open violence. This new proposal is called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it'll effectively repeal the Missouri Compromise. And just a refresher for everyone, that's the legislation we talked about earlier in the episode, where any new state admitted north of the 3630 parallel would be a free state. Any new state south of that parallel line would be admitted as a slave state. Well, with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the North could kiss whatever cultural safety net the Missouri Compromise provided goodbye. The fate of the new states and their laws concerning slavery would be decided by the citizens living in those states, and this is a concept that will be called popular sovereignty by those that proposed it. It's at this time the violence I mentioned before rears its head. It'll do so twice on the national stage, and the first takes place in none other than the chambers of the U.S. Senate. Senator Charles Sumner will be beaten to within an inch of his life while writing at his desk. Congressman Preston Brooks will enter the Senate chambers and use a gold-headed wooden cane to beat Senator Sumner with. The attack is in response to an anti-Kansas-Nebraska Act speech Sumner had given a few days earlier. And in that speech, he will insult Brooks's cousin, who was also a senator. But could you imagine watching C-SPAN and seeing a congressman beat a senator with a cane? I mean, as bad as our political climate can get at times, at least it hasn't deteriorated to that. Just remember that the next time you start to feel your blood pressure rise watching the news. The second national tragedy involves more lives than just a senator and a congressman. And as a result of this new concept, popular sovereignty, activists from both the pro and anti-slavery factions will flood into Kansas. And their goal is to try to sway the vote in that soon-to-be state to their respective camps. There are numerous stories of coercion as well as political and voting fraud, and it will not take long for those activists to get angry enough to enter into armed combat with the opposing side. That armed conflict will become known as Bleeding Kansas, and that's exactly what happens.
Are you thinking about starting your own podcast or YouTube channel, but find yourself in need of things like a logo, animation for your videos, or digital marketing materials? If so, Colby and I recommend using Fiverr. Fiverr bills itself as the world's largest digital services marketplace with over 11 million users in 190 countries. With Fiverr, you can find anything you need when it comes to graphics and design, digital marketing, writing and translation, video and animation, music and audio, programming and tech, business, and trending data. A whole world of freelance talent at your fingertips. Fiverr gives you quality work done quickly and at prices that work for every budget. And for your peace of mind, when commissioning one of their freelancers, you get protected payment every time, meaning you won't pay for something until you approve the work, so you never have to worry that your money is going to waste. With Fiverr, you also enjoy 24/7 support. Visit americafogofwar.com and follow the link Shop Fiverr, located in the menu at the top of the homepage, and find the right solution for you today.
I can remember being in my early school years and learning about actions and reactions in science. And everyone's heard this and knows it. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's evident to me now, though, that you don't have to be in science class to see this truth play out. Those last two things we talked about, the caning of Senator Sumner and bleeding Kansas, will themselves generate reactions both equal in scope and opposite in direction. After his caning, Senator Sumner became a type of martyr for the cause of freedom. His attack and bleeding Kansas will also be the last straw for the guy we started our story with. John Brown will have his anger stoked into a fury after reading what's happened in D.C. and what's happening still in Kansas. It'll enrage him so much that he will actually move with his sons and their families to Kansas. And they go there with the intention of answering violence with violence. And in May of 1856, John Brown will do just that. Leading a band of abolitionist settlers armed only with sabers, John Brown attacks and kills a party of 5 pro-slavery settlers. This becomes known as the Potawatomi Massacre, and in sort of a rinse-and-repeat fashion, Brown will do this again in places like Palmyra and Osawatomie, the latter, of course, being the origin of his nickname. And eventually, he's going to leave Kansas with his mind set on one thing, and that's the mission he believed God had laid at his feet, freeing the American slave. To give my version of a training sequence from a Rocky movie, Brown spent most of his adult life preparing for what's getting ready to take place. He's studied maps, he's gained an intimate knowledge of the Underground Railroad system, he's studied military tactics, insurrection, revolution, and anything else that could give him an edge, he studied. He had now just gained combat experience, though on a smaller level, with his time in Kansas, and he felt as ready as he'd ever be for the next step. That next step was to go to war. John Brown wanted to raise a brigade-sized force, that's around 4,500 guys, made up of free blacks and fugitive slaves. With his brigade, he planned on marching south and freeing every slave from every house, farm, and plantation he encountered. But first, John Brown would need the weapons to arm his brigade with. An armory in a small town called Harper's Ferry would serve that purpose perfectly. Nestled between the fork of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers, in what is today West Virginia, but at the time of Brown and his contemporaries would have been Virginia, Harper's Ferry was a town of great importance, and it'll be featured many times throughout this story. Now, unfortunately for Brown, his efforts at raising a substantial force to start this campaign with failed. And instead of 4,500 men, Brown would make his way to Harper's Ferry with only 21. And on the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and his force will set off to raid the armory in Harper's Ferry. On the way, they will cut various telegraph lines and stop off to free a few slaves and take a few slave owners as hostages as well. Brown will also retrieve George Washington's sword and wear the weapon during the raid to come. I mean, there's a little symbolism for you. The leader of the campaign to gain independence and freedom for the American slave, at least in Brown's mind, is wearing the sword of the leader who gained American independence from Great Britain. Picture perfect. Now, Brown and his force will enter Harper's Ferry around 11 p.m. by way of Railroad Bridge. And pretty much from the start, things go terribly wrong for Brown and his force. While still crossing the railroad bridge into town, Brown and his men will shoot a railroad employee trying to flee them. And with the heartbreaking irony that only fate can produce, Brown and his force have just shot a free black man named Hayward Shepherd, making the first casualty of Brown's war against American slavery one of the very people he desired to help, at least in a symbolic way. The raiding party will continue further into town, locate and subdue the armory watchman, and gain entry to the armory. At around 1:15 a.m. on the 17th, the eastbound B&O Express train from Wheeling, Virginia, now West Virginia, attempts to pass through Harper's Ferry. Brown and his men will stop and board the train, and Brown is reported to have talked to the passengers for a while. And then Brown makes what many believe to be his first mistake. He tells the train's crew that they were free to leave. Now, I have considered this from as many angles as I could think up, and I can't really settle on why I think he did this. Because it doesn't take a strategic mastermind to know that as soon as the train makes it to the next station, the alarm's going to be sounded and help's going to be on the way. But whatever his reasoning is, Brown lets the train depart Harper's Ferry at around 7 a.m. Now, if I was Brown and that just happened, it's about that time I'd be telling my guys, hey, let's pack everything up, get what you can out of the armory, we're getting out of here, it is time to go now. But Brown doesn't do that, and again, he makes a decision that confounds me. He decides to stay. Now, not too much later, armory employees start showing up at the armory for work, and Brown's men end up taking them hostage. Now, not too much later, word from that B&O train that had left Harper's Ferry earlier has gotten back to the next station. And the president of the railroad company notifies the president of the United States directly. The gig is up. And not only that, the word is starting to get out about what's happening in the armory. Citizens start converging on the armory, but wisely do so armed. And a gunfight ensues. A number of citizens are going to be killed, including Harper's Ferry's mayor. But the local citizens and militia do gain one massive advantage over Brown and his men when they seize control of the bridges leading out of town. And it doesn't take a genius to realize that being cut off from escape and surrounded is not a good position to be in. And so, in an effort to delay the inevitable, Brown and his men barricade themselves in a fire engine house that history has come to remember as John Brown's fort. Eventually, more militia will show up, as well as a U.S. Marine detachment from Washington, D.C., and they will be under the command of none other than U.S. Army Colonel, at least at the time, Robert E. Lee. The detachment of Marines would eventually breach the building that John Brown had barricaded himself inside of and kill or capture Brown's fighters. Even Brown himself is going to be wounded in the capture by a U.S. Marine lieutenant. And the initial public reaction to John Brown and all of this, at least as a whole, was that he was a psychotic terrorist. Some dude had just went down to Harper's Ferry, some peaceful little town in the middle of nowhere, and shot it up. But soon reporters and politicians will flood Harper's Ferry for one purpose, and that's to interview John Brown. And it's through those interviews that John Brown will strike the hardest blow against slavery he has yet. See, the people were expecting to be faced with a madman. But instead, what they encountered, and remember, this is really important for the story, this is a very religious time, right? These people believe deeply. And the person they encountered was an articulate man of God trying to do God's work. A reporter from the New York Herald took a verbatim transcript of an interview of John Brown conducted by Virginia Governor Henry Weiss and Virginia Senator James Mason. It's the most complete public statement on the raid we have from John Brown, and I highly recommend to all of you out there to Google and read it. But just to show you what I mean, I'm going to quote a few of the questions and responses from that interview. If you read the entire interview, you can get the sense that even the men interviewing him are surprised by the answers John Brown gives them. This is John Brown explaining his justification and intention for his raid to Senator Mason. Quote, "We came to free the slaves and only that." And then to answer how he justifies his acts, Brown says, quote, "I think, my friend, you are guilty of a great wrong against God and humanity. I say this without wishing to be offensive, but it would be perfectly right for anyone to interfere with you so far as to free those you willfully and wickedly hold in bondage. I do not say this insultingly." End quote. Later in the interview, an unnamed bystander asks a few questions of Brown, and this is one of those rare things for me. Even though it's just written literature, I can visualize it so easily, like I'm watching a movie, right? And I can see this bystander just enraged in this small stone brick room, right? And John Brown he's wounded, and he's got the cut bandaged on his neck, and he's got the manacles on his wrists, and he's sitting at the table, and he's just looking rough, but he's relaxed and he's calm. And I can see the bystander, "Do you consider this to be a religious movement?" And Brown answering just so calmly, "It is, in my opinion, the greatest service man can render to God." And then that just making the bystander even more angry. And, "Do you consider yourself an instrument in the hands of Providence?" And Brown saying very calmly, "I do." "And then, upon what principle do you justify your acts?" And it's in this answer that I'm going to quote verbatim that Brown just, his eloquence and grasp on the moment is undeniable. Brown answers this question of, what principle does he justify his actions on by saying this, quote, "Upon the golden rule, I pity the poor in bondage that have none to help them. That is why I am here, not to gratify any personal animosity, revenge, or vindictive spirit. It's in my sympathy with the oppressed and the wronged that are as good as you and as precious in the sight of God." End quote. Now there's one more final interaction between Brown and Governor Weiss, and it seems to me at least that Governor Weiss is trying to close the interview with the upper hand on a moral level at least. And he's going to tell Brown something to the effect of, "You're getting old, your time is approaching, you've got blood on your hands, you're going to be executed for this. Time to get these illusions of your actions being good out of your head and think upon eternity. Repent for your sins and your actions you've taken in this place." And Brown's answer is a beautiful melding of biblical and laconic speech. It's like the Bible's New Testament, like the language of the Bible's New Testament had a love child with the language of ancient Spartans. It's a line Yoda or Mr. Miyagi would say. Brown answers the governor with this, quote, "Governor, I have, from all appearances, not more than 15 or 20 years the start of you in the journey to that eternity of which you kindly warned me of. And whether my tenure here shall be 15 months or 15 days or 15 hours, I'm equally prepared to go. There's an eternity behind and an eternity before. And the little speck in the center, however long, is but comparatively a minute. The difference between your tenure and mine is trifling, and I want to therefore tell you to be prepared. I am prepared. You all have a heavy responsibility, and it behooves you to prepare more than it does me." End quote. I mean, it's spooky how good this guy is at foreshadowing. It makes it seem like he can see into the future because he's done it time and time and time again. Now, John Brown will eventually be taken from Harper's Ferry to Charlestown, where he will be tried for his actions in Harper's Ferry and subsequently executed by hanging. The moment had came, The man of destiny played his part, and the course of history would from that point be forever changed. Make sure to join us next time on America Fog of War as the opening rounds kick off and the reality of what war will cost makes itself known to the masses. Do you love America Fog of War and want more of it? If so, Brett and I would love it if you became a member of the America Fog of War Patreon. Visit americafogofwar.com and follow the link Become a Member located in the menu at the top of the homepage and pick from one of our 3 membership subscription options. As a member, you can enjoy ad-free early access to all of our free episodes, like this one, as well as gain access to not 1, but 2 extra episodes a month, and join either Brett or myself on a monthly Zoom call where you can help us make decisions pertaining to future episodes of America Fog of War, discuss war movies and books, and talk about some of your favorite American battles and campaigns, hip pocket class style. Your membership subscriptions are what enable us to bring you the content you love every month. Help us grow this podcast and become part of the team today at americafogofwar.com. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, make sure you never miss new ones by subscribing to the show on your podcast app of choice. And if you want to help us out with growing the show and enable us to bring you better content and more of it, then Brett and I ask that you leave us a 5-star review. It does a lot in helping us. Brett and I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay frosty.